This is the brief on the Philippines' massive crackdown on gambling and the new 2025 Anti-Pogo Act. While the Philippines has a long history of strictly regulating public morals, they've just dropped the ultimate hammer by completely outlying the massive offshore gaming industry. First, the new Anti-Pogo Act instantly shuts down all Philippine offshore gaming operators, or POGOs. It literally revokes all licenses, cancels alien employment permits, and mandates the deportation of foreign workers. It's like flipping a massive nationwide kill switch on an entire industry overnight. Second, the penalties are incredibly severe. So, what happens if someone tries to run a secret Pogo hub in the shadows? Well, they're looking at up to 12 years in prison and astronomical fines hitting 50 million pesos for third offenses. Crucially, these violations are now explicitly tied as predicate offenses to the Anti-Money Laundering Act and human trafficking laws. And if a government official gets involved, they completely lose their job and their retirement benefits. Finally, we need to look at the deep roots of this. This internet gaming ban stems directly from broader Title VI laws punishing crimes against public morals. The state already severely punishes local underground lotteries like Juateng and Masio, where just possessing gambling paraphernalia or acting as a street-level collector means mandatory prison time. Now, you might assume this Pogo ban is just about unpaid taxes or regulations, but really it's deeply rooted in a legal philosophy aimed at eradicating a social menace the state views as ruining the value of dignified work. The message from the Philippine government is crystal clear. When it comes to offshore operations and illegal numbers games, they are betting everything on wiping the board clean.
The Philippine Revised Penal Code historically handled gambling under Title VI. The law framed illicit betting as a crime against public morals. Under Presidential Decree 1602, the enforcement mechanism was physical. The state penalized the person handing over cash and the local operator maintaining the table. This photograph shows a standard piece of physical evidence from that era, a Juateng receipt with stamped numbers. Police would raid a physical location, seize these paper slips, and arrest the participants. Then the wagers digitized. Philippine offshore gaming operators, or POGOs, moved the bets to fiber optic cables and server racks, targeting a transnational audience. The traditional statute stalled. A police force cannot raid a virtual table when the players are in another country. The servers are shielded inside a free port zone, and the operating syndicate holds a state-issued corporate license. Public morals laws didn't scale to a multi-billion-dollar digital industry. The state needed a new way to apply legal force. In October 2025, Congress passed Republic Act 12312, declaring an absolute ban on offshore gaming operations. The legislature abandoned the tactic of simply declaring the game itself illegal. They engineered a statutory dragnet. Instead of chasing individual bets, the law weaponizes three separate areas of jurisdiction: corporate regulations, immigration status, and property forfeiture. Section 18 of the Act explicitly repeals the prior law, RA 11590, eliminating any pretense of taxing or regulating the industry. RA 12312 is a blueprint designed to systematically strip away the logistical, technological, and administrative components that allow a transnational syndicate to operate. To understand how this blueprint works, we have to look at the baseline legal concept of escalating liability, first perfected against illegal numbers games in Republic Act 9287. This text from RA 9287 shows how penalties scale strictly based on organizational role. At the bottom of the pyramid, a simple bettor faces 30 to 90 days of imprisonment. Looking further down the statute, punishment escalates. Coordinators and maintainers face 10 to 14 years. At the apex, financiers and protectors receive the maximum penalty, up to 20 years, for providing capital and protection. The Anti-Pogo Act takes this theory of liability and scales it to target massive corporate entities. An offshore operation is a digitized numbers game. The legislative response targets the structural enablers rather than the end users. Offshore gaming operations depend on proprietary digital infrastructure. Section 3 of the Act introduces definitions for POGO gaming content providers, the software designers, and accredited service providers who handle IT support. Section 4 criminalizes acting as one of these providers. The state is outlawing the IT backbone. This image of a dense server farm represents the hardware targeted next. The law makes the mere introduction, use, or possession of Pogo gaming equipment and digital paraphernalia inside the Philippines a criminal offense. By outlawing both the hardware and the software support directly, the statute chokes off the syndicate's operational capacity before a digital wager can cross Philippine borders. Moving up the supply chain brings us to physical logistics. Digital servers and foreign workforces require real estate. Section 4F prohibits any aiding or abetting of offshore gaming, specifically citing the act of leasing or subleasing any building for that purpose. Commercial landlords can no longer claim ignorance. Facilitating the physical space is now a primary criminal offense. Next is the administrative hurdle, neutralizing operations that hide behind legitimate state-issued licenses. This POG Court Club sign represents the authorizations targeted by Section 5's bureaucratic kill switch. The law mandates the permanent revocation of all POGO licenses previously issued. Section 6 attacks the human capital. The Department of Labor cancels alien employment permits, and immigration revokes visas, triggering summary deportation. Stripping away real estate rights, corporate licenses, and immigration status simultaneously allows the state to legally disintegrate the company without enduring a lengthy criminal trial. Consider the aftermath of these actions. The building is empty, the licenses are revoked, and the workers are deported, but the physical hardware and illicit financial proceeds remain inside the territory. Under Section 15, the government executes civil forfeiture. The servers, paraphernalia, and proceeds are seized independent of any individual's criminal conviction. Section 8 binds the offshore gaming ban to the Anti-Money Laundering Act, declaring any violation of the Anti-POGO Act an unlawful activity and predicate offense. Section 9 connects operations to the expanded Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act. Recruiting workers for these offshore hubs is formally recognized as human trafficking. The legislation ensures the syndicates lose their operational base, forfeit illicit profits, and remain exposed to prosecution for systemic human rights abuses. Philippine gambling laws moved past policing local customs to dismantle highly organized transnational syndicates. The Anti-POGO Act of 2025 demonstrates that neutralizing a modern digital syndicate requires an engineered statute that unplugs the servers, evicts the tenants, and revokes the visas.
This is the brief on the legal evolution of public morals and child protection. Our legal framework has shifted from broadly protecting society's general decency to enacting strict, specialized protections focused entirely on vulnerable child victims. So why did the law need to evolve from just protecting good customs to creating highly specialized laws? First, let's look at the old standard under the revised Penal Code. Article 200 punished grave scandal, but only if the acts were highly scandalous and right in plain public sight. Private acts totally didn't count. Then, Article 201 judged obscenity using the Copting test, basically asking if media shocks ordinary common sense. But since ordinary common sense acts like a societal thermometer, doesn't this kind of make obscenity a moving target? Second, let's dive into the huge shift to victim protection. Recognizing that general morals just weren't enough, RA 7610 was passed. Under this law, a child in prostitution is strictly treated as a victim. Prosecutors don't even need to prove habituality anymore, meaning even a single instance is a severe crime. And if the child is under 12 or videos involved, offenders face maximum penalties. Think of this legal upgrade like switching from a general neighborhood watch to a specialized VIP bodyguard just for kids. Finally, RA 7610 significantly broadens the net. It expands abuse to cover neglect, cruelty, and mendicancy, like forcing kids to beg. Crucially, unlike those older laws, mere attempts to commit child prostitution are fully punishable. Now, you might ask, why punish just the attempt? Well, because waiting for the actual crime to happen means the system has already failed the child. Ultimately, the law has transformed from merely policing public scandals to actively and aggressively shielding our most vulnerable.
You know, we all have our own personal ideas about what constitutes right and wrong, but how exactly does the state legally define and punish behavior that shocks an entire community? Let's dive right into this explainer and explore the fascinating and sometimes blurry legal boundary that separates a private indiscretion from a full-blown public crime under Philippine law. So, where exactly is that line in the sand? To answer that, we need to look at Title VI of the revised Penal Code. Specifically, we're talking about crimes against public morals. This is a really unique space in the law. It's not necessarily about who gets hurt physically. Instead, it's where the state steps in to protect the fragile social contract of decency that holds a community together. And if we drill down just a bit further, our primary legal shield against this comes from Chapter 2, Offenses Against Decency and Good Customs. This chapter is basically the foundational playbook the law uses against acts and materials that threaten public morality. Take Article 20, for instance, grave scandal. Now, to modern ears, that term sounds incredibly broad, doesn't it? You might be thinking it applies to any really juicy neighborhood gossip, but the law actually requires very specific, concrete triggers for an act to cross the line into criminal territory. It's actually a super strict formula. Let's break down the 4 critical elements. First, the offender has to perform an act. Second, that act must be highly scandalous. Third, it can't already fall under other specific laws, like acts of lasciviousness. And fourth, this is the big one, it must happen in a public place or view. This strict checklist is absolutely crucial because it protects ordinary citizens from being convicted based on mere rumors. Literally, if even one of these elements is missing, the whole thing falls apart, and the legal threshold just isn't met. The ultimate legal trigger here? Publicity. As we see in the jurisprudence of U.S. versus Catage, the law makes a massive distinction based entirely on location. It sounds wild, but the exact same scandalous act that is perfectly legal in the shadows of your own private living room becomes a crime the second you step out into the town square.
To really see how strictly the courts apply this rule, consider the classic case of U.S. versus Samaniego. So here you have a married woman who is habitually frequenting these suspicious, vacant houses with her paramour. To the entire community, this was incredibly obvious and completely shocking. Surely that counts as grave scandal, right?
Actually, no. The court totally threw it out. Why? Because despite the glaringly obvious implications of what she was doing, there were no explicitly scandalous physical acts performed in public view. This ruling is a perfect example of just how rigidly the courts enforce that boundary of public visibility. Okay, let's shift gears and look at Article 201, Immoral Doctrines, Obscene Publications, and Exhibitions. While Article 200 is mostly dealing with a fleeting physical moment in time, Article 201 tackles a whole different beast, materials and published ideas that can permanently circulate and corrupt public morals. And the law casts a massive net here. It targets the entire life cycle of obscenity. We're talking about everyone from the original person writing the immoral doctrine, to the editor who publishes the piece, all the way down to the vendor selling it on the street, or the theater projecting it on a screen. No one in that chain gets a free pass. But here is the catch, and it's an important one. Writing something absolutely obscene in your private diary, not a crime under Article 201. The state does not police your private thoughts or your private notebooks. The actual crime is born the exact moment you knowingly release that material out into the public stream. That line between private sharing and public distribution is everything. In People v. Tempaco, the court ruled that simply handing an indecent pamphlet to just one single person in private doesn't count as distribution under the law. Once again, it's the public nature, the mass distribution, that forces the state to step in. Which naturally brings us to a really tough question. How on earth does a judge define what is truly obscene, especially when cultural norms are shifting every single generation? What shocked our grandparents barely makes us blink today. It's incredibly tricky to pin down, which is why the courts had to adopt a very specific, enduring legal anchor. Enter the famous Cottinger test, which comes from the case of U.S. versus Cottinger. This test completely removes personal taste from the equation. Instead, it asks, is the material deliberately designed to stir up impure imaginations? Does it debase sensibilities and corrupt minds that are open to immoral influences? That is the true benchmark. And, context is absolutely everything. Let's look at People versus Gopindin. The court made a really fascinating distinction here between art and commerce. They basically ruled that even a tiny, slight degree of obscenity becomes a full-blown crime if it's put on display purely to make a quick buck, rather than for genuine artistic expression. In the eyes of the law, profit kind of weaponizes the obscenity. Now we reach the absolute climax of this legal framework. This is where the tone shifts completely from just maintaining general public decency to absolute, uncompromising severity. When public morals intersect with the welfare of children, Republic Act 7610 drops the hammer. Under RA 7610, if obscenity involves kids in any way, whether they are induced to perform in live shows, used to pose in videos, or featured in publications, the state shows zero mercy. The penalties instantly skyrocket to prison mayor. We are talking severe, mandatory multi-year prison sentences. The focus is entirely on protecting the vulnerable. And it gets even stricter. The absolute most severe qualifying circumstance you need to know about this law: if the victimized child involved in any of these obscene exhibitions is under 12 years old, the law demands the maximum possible penalty. Period. There is no wiggle room. Furthermore, the state doesn't just stop at locking up the offender. They completely eradicate the threat. Upon conviction under any of these obscenity laws, all prohibited articles, materials, and paraphernalia are immediately forfeited to the government for one specific purpose: totally wiping them out. They destroy it all. So, what's the big takeaway here? Well, these laws force us to recognize that public morals are built on a pretty fragile, constantly evolving agreement. And with the lines between our private lives and the public sphere blurring every single day right on our smartphones, it really makes you wonder, how are these strict 20th century definitions of grave scandal and obscenity going to survive in our hyper-connected digital world? Where exactly will the law draw the line in the sand tomorrow?
Title 6 of the revised Penal Code covers crimes against public morals, specifically gambling and betting, defined in Articles 195 through 199, which were later repealed by Presidential Decree No. 1602. Penalties are imposed on participants, maintainers, and conductors of illegal gambling schemes, with higher penalties for recidivism and government officials. The punishable acts of gambling include participation in various illegal or unauthorized activities and games. These include cockfighting, jueteng, jialai, and horse racing, along with bookie operations and game fixing. Further illegal activities categorized as punishable gambling acts encompass various forms of lotteries such as numbers and bingo, as well as specific card and dice games like Caraway Cruise, Pompiang, 7-Eleven, and Blackjack. The list continues with other prohibited games including Lucky 9, poker and its derivatives, Monty, Baccarat, Quaho, Panginge, other card games, Pakwe, and High and Low. Additional punishable acts include mahjong, domino, other games using plastic tiles, slot machines, roulette, pinball, and other mechanical contraptions and devices. Illegal participation extends to various forms of betting in races and sports. This covers dog, boat, and car racing, along with other forms of races. It also includes betting on games like basketball, boxing, volleyball, bowling, and ping pong. Other illegal activities include individual or team contests involving game fixing, point shaving, and other machinations. It also covers banking or percentage games and other games where money or value representatives are wagered. It is punishable to knowingly permit gambling in a place owned or controlled by the offender, whether it's an inhabited place, a building, a vessel, or other means of transportation. Qualifying circumstances apply if the place has a reputation for gambling, where gambling is frequently carried, or if it is a public building. Other punishable acts include knowingly possessing prohibited articles related to gambling without lawful purpose. This also applies to maintainers, conductors, or bankers of gambling schemes, as well as security personnel of gambling places. Also penalized is being personnel in gambling operations or involvement in game fixing, point shaving, and machination. It's important to note that playing for money is not a necessary element in gambling, as per the U.S. versus Rafael case. The Act increasing penalties for illegal numbers games, Republic Act No. 9287, outlines the state policy to eradicate illegal gambling. The policy emphasizes social order, prosperity, independence, and freeing people from poverty by adopting more stringent measures against illegal numbers games. The Act defines, quote, illegal numbers game as any gambling activity using numbers or combinations for jackpots. Specific games defined include, quote, jueteng, involving combinations of 37 or 38 numbers, and masiao, where the winning combination is derived from jialai results. The Act also defines, quote, last two as an illegal numbers game, where the winning combination is based on the last two numbers of the winning sweepstakes ticket. It also details the roles of bettor, personnel or staff, and collector or agent in these illegal operations. Other defined roles within the illegal numbers game operation include the coordinator, controller, or supervisor, the maintainer, manager, or operator, the financiers or capitalist, and the protector or coddler. Penalties for participation in illegal numbers games vary by role. A bettor faces 30 to 90 days of imprisonment. Personnel or staff face 6 years, and 1 day to 8 years. The same penalty applies to those who allow their property to be used.
A collector or agent faces 8 years and 1 day to 10 years of imprisonment. Penalties are increased for higher-ranking roles. Coordinators, controllers, or supervisors face 10 years and 1 day to 12 years. Maintainers, managers, or operators face 12 years and 1 day to 14 years. Financiers or capitalists face 14 years and 1 day to 16 years. Protectors or coddlers face 16 years and 1 day to 20 years of imprisonment. Possession of gambling paraphernalia in illegal numbers game operations is considered prima facie evidence of an offense. Government employees or public officials involved face 12 to 20 years imprisonment, a fine, and perpetual absolute disqualification from public office. Local government officials with knowledge of illegal numbers games in their jurisdiction who fail to take action are perpetually disqualified from public office. Law enforcers who fail to apprehend perpetrators face administrative suspension or dismissal. Parents, guardians, or persons exercising moral authority over a minor who induce the minor to commit offenses under this act face imprisonment and a fine, in addition to being deprived of their authority. Recidivists who commit offenses under this act will face the penalty next higher in degree. Immunity from prosecution is granted to any person who serves as a witness or provides evidence, subject to compliance with Presidential Decree No. 1732. Prosecution under this act is without prejudice to other laws. During the case's pendency, properties and income subject to confiscation will be held in custodia legis, and no bond will be admitted for their release. Provisional remedies under the revised rules on criminal procedure should be used. Upon conviction, all proceeds, paraphernalia, and property used in illegal numbers games are confiscated and forfeited to the state. Assets disproportionate to lawful income are presumed proceeds of the offense and forfeited. Witnesses who provide testimonial or documentary evidence for investigation or prosecution of offenses under this act will be placed under the Witness Protection Program as per Republic Act No. 6981. Informers who disclose information leading to the offender's arrest and conviction may be rewarded a percentage of the confiscated cash or articles of value, determined by policy guidelines from the DOJ, DILG, and NEPOLCOM. Chapter 2 of Title VI covers offenses against decency and good customs. This includes grave scandal, defined in Article 200 of the Revised Penal Code. The elements of grave scandal include the offender performing acts that are highly scandalous, offending decency and good customs. This must be causative of public scandal due to publicity and character. Grave scandal is not applicable if the scandalous act is punished under other articles of the Revised Penal Code, such as acts of lasciviousness or malicious mischief. The act must also be committed in a public place or within public knowledge or view. Immoral doctrines, obscene publications, and exhibitions are covered under Article 201 of the Revised Penal Code, as amended by Presidential Decree No. 969. The penalties are specified in this article, with additional penalties for government officials allowing the violation. Acts punished include publicly expounding doctrines contrary to public morals, authoring obscene literature and knowingly allowing its publication, and selling obscene literature. The test for obscenity is whether the material is offensive to chastity, decency, or delicacy, or if it tends to deprave or corrupt. The punishable acts also include exhibiting indecent or immoral shows. An example is displaying for commercial purposes pictures with a slight degree of obscenity, not for art's sake, which violates Article 201. Selling, giving away, or exhibiting articles offensive to morals is also penalized. Giving away is understood as distribution, and if convicted, prohibited articles are forfeited for destruction. If acquitted, forfeiture still occurs after proceedings, with the aggrieved party's remedy being an appeal to the Secretary of National Defense. Republic Act No. 7610 severely penalizes obscene publications and indecent shows involving children. This includes shiring, employing, using, persuading, inducing, or coercing a child to perform in obscene exhibitions, indecent shows, or pose in pornographic materials. The penalty for these offenses is prison mayor in its medium period, which is higher if the child is below 12 years old. Prostitution is covered under Article 202 of the Revised Penal Code, as amended by Republic Act No. 10158, which decriminalized vagrancy. Child prostitution under Republic Act No. 7610 treats the child as a victim, not an offender, and habitual participation is not required. The law also covers both genders, and the mere attempt to commit child prostitution is punishable. Mendicancy and abetting mendicancy are covered by Presidential Decree No. 1563. A vagrant becomes a mendicant if begging is used as a means of living. Penalties increase for second and subsequent convictions, and giving alms directly in public places is considered abetting mendicancy. Using, coercing, forcing, or intimidating street children or other children in mendicancy is severely penalized as other acts of child abuse under Republic Act No. 7610 and Presidential Decree No. 603. This video will explore the architecture of public morals in the Philippines, examining Title VI and the Anti-Pogo Act of 2025. We will trace the evolution of legal frameworks from street corner issues to challenges in cyberspace. The Title VI framework divides into two chapters: Gambling and Betting, which includes the Anti-Pogo Act, and Decency and Good Customs. The legal strategy has shifted from policing individual moral failings to dismantling complex, organized exploitation networks. Traditional gambling, under PD 1602, criminalizes over 39 distinct forms of unauthorized games, including various card games, lotteries, sports betting, and mechanical devices. Importantly, playing for money is not a necessary element of gambling. The illegal numbers syndicate operates in tiers, with escalating penalties for higher-level involvement. Enforcement is red, indicating severe penalties, especially for high-tier financiers and protectors. Government employees acting as tiers 3 to 5 face perpetual disqualification. The Anti-Pogo Act of 2025 addresses the global threat of offshore gaming. It bans the establishment, operation, and acceptance of bets related to offshore gaming operations in the Philippines, declaring them unlawful. The Pogo ecosystem includes the core operator, local gaming agents, Pogo hubs or sites, and accredited service providers. The Anti-Pogo Act explicitly outlaws every connected spoke in this network, not just the central operator. The law criminalizes enablers through corporate concealment, document forgery, infrastructure leasing, and border facilitation. Providing logistical or infrastructural support to a POGO is now treated as a direct violation of public morals law. The unwinding mechanism for RA 12312 involves a 5-step enforcement strategy. This includes a license revocation, visa cancellation and deportation, tax audits, asset forfeiture, and worker transition programs for affected Filipino workers. Severe penalties for POGO violations escalate with subsequent offenses, including substantial fines and imprisonment, with no probation allowed. Violations also integrate with the Anti-Money Laundering Act and the human trafficking ban. This table highlights the paradigm shift from local illegal syndicates to offshore ecosystems. Offshore gaming involves transnational infrastructure, money laundering, and human trafficking, contrasting with the local focus of traditional gambling. The revised Penal Code establishes decency standards through grave scandal and obscene publications and exhibitions. Grave scandal requires highly scandalous public conduct, while obscenity involves publishing or exhibiting indecent material, subject to the obscenity test. The decency threshold matrix compares grave scandal and obscene publications with child exploitation. For child exploitation, the crime is the mere production or use of the child, and the publicity requirement is irrelevant. The law redefines the victim by protecting the vulnerable. In child prostitution, the child is legally recognized as an exploited victim. Mendicancy is treated as exploitation when street children are coerced or forced into begging, carrying severe penalties for the exploiter. In synthesis, the evolution of public morals reflects a shift from individual to syndicate issues, local to transnational threats, and punishment to protection of vulnerable populations. Title VI is now a sophisticated blueprint for dismantling organized criminal ecosystems.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're diving into a seriously fascinating evolution of Philippine criminal law. We're going on a journey that takes us all the way from street-level offenses right up to massive digital offshore operations. Think about it. How does a nation define, regulate, and ultimately police public morality? Well, the answer lies in a complex web of laws that have had to radically shift just to match the speed of modern technology. Here is our roadmap for today. First, crimes against public morals. Second, the illegal numbers games. Third, scandals, obscenity, and exploitation. Fourth, the Anti-Pogo Act. Fifth, shutting down the hubs. And finally, penalties and forfeitures. Okay, let's dive into this.
Section 1. Crimes against public morals, the foundations of decency.
To really understand the present, we've got to establish the baseline. Title VI of the revised Penal Code is essentially where the state draws its line in the sand regarding what it considers offenses against public decency and good customs. We're talking everything from gambling and betting to offenses against decency. But you might be wondering, why does the law care so much about these specific acts? This quote, straight from Republic Act No. 9287, answers that perfectly. The state doesn't just view gambling as a bad habit, right? It explicitly condemns it as a widespread social menace and a source of corruption. The underlying argument is that instant monetary gains from illegal gambling basically destroy the value of dignified work. This is a powerful declaration of policy, and it sets the stakes for exactly why the government takes these activities so incredibly seriously.
Section 2. The illegal numbers games, street-level betting.
With that foundation in mind, let's look at our first major focus, the traditional, localized, illegal numbers games. Long before the internet was a thing, these were the games that historically plagued streets and neighborhoods. The legal syllabus gives us precise statutory definitions for the two most notorious ones. First up, chouetting. It's basically a local lottery using a combination of 37 numbers, where bets are placed and accepted per combination. Then there's masayo, where the winning combination is actually derived from the results of Jai Alai games. The law is incredibly specific here. Why? To ensure these local operations can be definitively identified and prosecuted. And this brilliantly illustrates the who of a gambling ring. Because it's almost never just a single offender, is it? Republic Act 9287 meticulously breaks down the entire gambling hierarchy. You've got the coordinator, or encargado, who supervises the agents on the ground. Above them is the maintainer or operator, who manages a specific area. Higher up still is the financier or capitalist, the one funding the whole shebang. And finally, sitting at the very top, the protector or coddler. This is the person providing the shield for the entire operation. The state clearly recognizes that to kill the weed, you absolutely have to rip out the roots. Because they understand that hierarchy so well, the punishment perfectly mirrors the level of responsibility. Notice how the escalation works here. A simple bettor is looking at 30 to 90 days in prison. Not great. But watch what happens as you move up the ladder. The hammer drops hard. Staff face 6 to 8 years. A coordinator gets 10 to 12 years. The financier is staring down 14 to 16 years. And the ultimate target, that protector or coddler we just talked about, they face a staggering 16 to 20 years behind bars. The law is deliberately designed to crush the orchestrators rather than just sweeping up the street-level participants. Section 3. Scandals, obscenity, and exploitation. Now, public morals aren't just about gambling. Let's shift our focus over to the other side of Title VI, looking at how the law regulates behavior, decency, and most importantly, how it protects the vulnerable. What's really fascinating about grave scandal under Article 200 is its defining element. Yes, the law penalizes acts that are highly scandalous and offend decency, but there's a major catch. The absolute key element here is publicity. To actually be a grave scandal, the act must be committed in a public place or within public view. So if a highly scandalous act happens behind closed doors and is seen by only one person, well, under the strict interpretation of this specific article, it doesn't meet the threshold for grave scandal because that public element is missing. Building on that, the state has an absolute arsenal of laws fiercely dedicated to protecting public decency, and specifically shielding the vulnerable. Article 201 goes straight after obscene literature and immoral shows. But where the law truly draws a hard line, showing zero tolerance, is when it comes to minors. Republic Act 7610 slaps severe penalties on using children in any obscene exhibitions or child prostitution. And notably, it treats the child strictly as a victim, never an offender. On top of that, Presidential Decrees 1563 and 603 penalize not just begging, but the exploitation of children for begging or leading an immoral life. The message couldn't be clearer. Exploit the vulnerable, and you will meet the full, unyielding force of the law.
So, we've seen how the state handles the streets. But what happens when the menace evolves? What happens when it's no longer just a local jutang coordinator, but a massive, international, digital operation hiding in plain sight inside giant commercial complexes?
Section 4. The Anti-Pogo Act of 2025.
Enter Republic Act No. 12312, the Anti-Pogo Act of 2025. This is the state's sweeping, ultra-modern solution to a highly complex, international problem that vastly outscaled the traditional street-level games we were just looking at. To truly grasp the law, we have to define the target. A Philippine offshore gaming operator, or POGO, is legally defined as an entity conducting online games of chance via the internet. The unique dynamic here is entirely geographic. They're physically operating their networks and software from within the Philippines. But the games? They're completely catered to offshore players, operating here, catering there. And under this new 2025 law, the state has declared them absolutely banned and totally unlawful.
What makes the Anti-POGO Act so wild is its scope. It doesn't just ban the act of gambling itself, it literally outlaws the entire support ecosystem. Looking at the prohibited acts, yes, establishing a POGO is obviously illegal. But guess what? So is acting as their IT service provider. Creating a POGO hub, illegal. Even a landlord who merely leases a building or someone leasing vehicles to an offshore gaming operation is committing a prohibited act. The law even explicitly targets people providing fake IDs or facilitating the illegal entry of foreign workers. It is a complete, systemic shutdown of the whole operation.
Section 5. Shutting down the hubs.
Let's move to and see how this builds. Because banning an industry on paper is one thing, right? But how is the government actually enforcing this absolute ban logistically? What does that eradication process look like in real time? Well, the law outlines a rapid, highly aggressive administrative process. Step 1. All existing licenses issued by PAGCOR or the economic zones are permanently revoked. Period. Step 2. All alien employment permits and visas issued to POGO workers are immediately canceled. And Step 3. The Bureau of Immigration is legally mandated to deport these foreign nationals directly to their country of birth. It's a swift, highly coordinated dismantling of these massive hubs.
However, you have to consider the fallout. The sweeping closure of these huge hubs inevitably displaces local citizens who are working in support roles. To address this, the law actually mandates a Filipino workers' transition program. Government agencies like DOLE and TESDA are legally required to step in and formulate programs to upskill, reskill, and facilitate new employment for the affected Filipino workers. It's essentially a mandatory government safety net built right into the eradication of the industry.
Section 6. Penalties and forfeitures. The hammer.
Okay, we've covered the what and the how. Now we reach the final act, the consequences. And let me tell you, the Anti-POGO Act brings staggering penalties for anyone defying this ban. First, we have to look at exactly who is committing the crime. Just like the older gambling laws we discussed, this new act aggressively targets government corruption. If a regular offender is caught, they face standard imprisonment and massive fines. But if a public official or government employee is involved, the law drops an absolute anvil on them. They get hit with the maximum applicable penalty, immediate dismissal, perpetual disqualification from ever holding public office again, and, this is huge, the complete forfeiture of all their retirement benefits.
Let's talk numbers, because the sheer scale here is just mind-boggling. 15 million pesos. Under the Anti-POGO Act, that is merely the minimum fine for a first-time offense, and it comes fully bundled with 6 to 8 years in prison.
And if someone is foolish enough to actually reach a third offense, that financial penalty skyrockets to a maximum of 50 million pesos, alongside 10 to 12 years of imprisonment. These numbers aren't just random. They directly reflect the massive financial scale of digital offshore gambling and show the state's absolute determination to make the punishment vastly outweigh any potential profit.
So the crucial point is this: the government doesn't just put the operators in jail and fine them, it completely absorbs and destroys the physical infrastructure itself. Under this law, any building or facility used directly or indirectly for a POGO is completely forfeited to the government. Every cent of the proceeds is seized, and all those endless rows of computers and high-tech gaming equipment, the law mandates they shall be completely destroyed by the seizing authority. We are talking about a total, scorched earth wipeout of the enterprise.
We have seen an incredible evolution today. The state has escalated its regulatory might from chasing local jueteng operators on street corners all the way to seizing massive international server hubs and slamming down 50 million peso fines. But as we all know, innovation never sleeps. As digital technology evolves even further into virtual reality, decentralized networks, and places we haven't even thought of yet, what is going to be the next frontier in regulating public morals? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning and keep asking questions.
Imagine you are walking down a bustling city street.
Right. Okay.
It is a super hot afternoon. Traffic is just crawling. And as you cross a pedestrian bridge, you see someone huddled on the concrete.
Right. A common sight in a lot of cities.
Exactly. And they're clearly starving. Maybe they're holding a battered cup.
Yeah.
And, Human instinct just kicks in. Empathy kicks in.
Of course.
You reach into your pocket, you pull out a coin, and you drop it into their hand.
Which is, I mean, in almost any moral framework on earth, a basic act of charity.
Exactly. You just did a good deed. But according to the legal documents we are unpacking today, you didn't just do a good deed.
No, you did not.
You actually committed a crime.
Yeah.
And the government actively wants to penalize you for it.
It is a profoundly jarring realization.
It really is.
Because when we look at how a state legislates human behavior, the line between like moral virtue and criminal liability, Adir, it can completely flip. It depends entirely on the broader societal context that the state is trying to engineer. So the act of handing over that coin is viewed by the state not as charity, but as, well, the fueling of a highly organized, deeply cynical exploitation economy.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are talking directly to you, our dedicated learner, because you have handed us a fascinating, frankly, massive stack of legal documents today.
Yeah, this isn't exactly light beach reading you've given us.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
You've given us excerpts from a 2025 to 2026 Criminal Law 2 syllabus, specifically the section focusing on crimes against public morals.
Right.
And alongside that historical baseline, you've also dropped the hot-off-the-presses Republic Act number 12312, which is widely known as the Anti-POGO Act of 2025.
The scope of what we are looking at today is just staggering. I mean, we are tracking a society's legal evolution over decades here.
Decades of changing rules.
Exactly. We are going to see how the law attempts to police morality, starting from the hyper-local stuff.
Like street-level games.
Yeah, the street-level card games, the neighborhood cockpits, the basic definitions of public decency.
Right.
And then tracing that exact same legal philosophy all the way up to the complete dismantling of multi-billion-dollar, digitally-driven international offshore gaming hubs.
So the fundamental question woven through all these pages, it seems to be this. How does a society actually protect its foundational values?
That is the core of it, yes.
How does it defend itself against traditional, highly visible vices on a street corner while also, fighting these borderless, almost invisible technological threats?
And what you see in the text is that the law is constantly running. It is constantly adjusting its mechanisms to try and answer that exact question.
To understand the massive 2025 paradigm shift regarding those international gaming hubs, though, we first have to understand the bedrock.
We do. We have to go back to where the law established its baseline for what even constitutes a threat to public morals in the first place.
Right, which means looking closely at Title VI of the revised Penal Code.
Yes, and the sweeping expansions made by Presidential Decree number 1602.
Which is basically the foundation of the state's war on illegal gambling, right?
Exactly. It is the architectural blueprint for everything that follows.
Okay, so looking at this syllabus, the very first thing that jumps off the page to me is the sheer, overwhelming granularity of it.
It is incredibly detailed.
I mean, the state didn't just write a law saying, hey, gambling is illegal, don't do it.
No, they did not.
They compiled this highly specific list of 39 distinct acts, games, and mechanics that are punishable. It literally reads like an encyclopedic menu of illicit entertainment.
And that was very intentional. The lawmakers were intentionally leaving zero room for ambiguity here.
Because ambiguity is what lawyers use, right?
Precisely. In criminal law, ambiguity is the ultimate defense. I mean, if you just ban the word gambling, a defense attorney will spend months arguing that their client's specific activity was a game of skill.
Right, or like a cultural tradition or something.
Exactly, or just a harmless pastime. By listing 39 specific games, the state gave law enforcement an exact, unquestionable checklist.
Okay, let's look at what is actually on this list because it covers an incredible spectrum.
It really does.
You have the cultural classics that have been around for centuries, right? Cockfighting, Joy Ting, Jalai.
Right.
You have horse racing, but the law specifically targets the bookie operations and the game-fixing aspects.
And then it moves into the card games, literally calling out poker, baccarat, monte, Quaho, and penging by name.
Which is wild. And it covers tile games like mahjong and domino. It covers mechanical and casino-style games like roulette and pinball.
If pinball is in there.
And slot machines. And it even extends this massive net over sports betting. We are talking basketball, boxing, dog racing, and boat racing.
And within those sports, The law specifically criminalizes game fixing, point shaving, and what it very broadly terms other machinations.
Okay, point shaving. That is a crucial detail to include, right?
It is, because point shaving isn't about throwing a game entirely.
Right. You still want to win.
Yes, it is about a player intentionally manipulating the final score to ensure it falls under or over a specific betting spread, usually while still allowing their team to win.
So it's very subtle.
Very subtle, highly sophisticated. And the state categorizes this highly sophisticated sports manipulation under the exact same legal umbrella as like a group of people playing cards in an alley.
Wow.
Because both are considered fundamental threats to public morals.
Well, speaking of alleys, the items on this list that really made me pause were the highly specific, incredibly localized street games.
Oh, yes.
I mean, the law goes completely out of its way to
Yeah.
specifically criminalize games like Carry Cruise and Pompeyang.
Right.
And for those who might not know, Carry Cruise is literally just the tossing of coins. You just bet on heads or tails.
That's it. It's that simple.
It requires zero equipment, zero infrastructure, just a couple of coins and a sidewalk.
Yeah.
So why is the state so uniquely threatened by something so simple that it warrants an explicit mention in a national penal decree?
Well, the simplicity is exactly what makes it threatening to the state.
Really? How so?
Because Cara Cruz has an incredibly low barrier to entry. You don't need to build a casino. You don't need a deck of cards. You don't even need a table.
Right. Literally just the coins in your pocket.
Exactly. And this immediacy means the vice can permeate the poorest neighborhoods instantly. There is no friction.
Wow. Okay.
The state views these hyper-accessible games as a vacuum that just sucks up the daily wages of the most economically vulnerable citizens. The law is stepping in to try and plug that vacuum.
And the law doesn't just stop at the people throwing the coins, right?
Well, it goes much further.
Presidential Decree 1602 has an entire section dedicated to what it calls qualifying circumstances.
Right.
Which means it defines the environment of the crime, not just the act itself.
Because the state recognizes that a gambling operation requires infrastructure, even if it's just a physical space to gather.
So if you own the space, you're in trouble.
Yes. The law criminalizes the act of knowingly permitting gambling in a place you own or control.
Like an apartment?
That could be a residential building, a commercial vessel, or any form of transportation. So if you own a ferry and you let people run a baccarat ring on the lower deck, you are criminally liable.
But the net gets thrown even wider than that.
It does.
It is considered a qualifying circumstance, meaning the penalty is significantly harsher if the place in question has a reputation as a gambling den.
Yes, reputation is key here.
Or if the gambling takes place in a public building or a barangay hall, which is, the local neighborhood government center.
The inclusion of the word reputation is a fascinating legal tool. I mean, you don't necessarily have to be caught in the act of facilitating a game on a random Tuesday.
Right.
If the state can prove your establishment is widely known in the community as a safe haven for illegal betting, that reputation itself is weaponized against you in court.
That is intense. And the law applies strict liability to the staff of these places, too.
Absolutely.
Let's say you are just a private security guard. You're just hired to stand outside a building.
Right, you're just doing your job.
Exactly. But if that building has a reputation for gambling, you are legally entangled. Watchmen, private detectives, lookouts, the state considers all of them essential cogs in the gambling machine.
Because they are providing the security apparatus that allows the moral decay to continue, therefore, they are culpable.
Okay, I want to dive into a specific piece of case law from the syllabus that completely scrambled my understanding of all this.
Okay, let's hear it.
It's the case of U.S. versus Raphael.
Ah, yes. A classic.
The syllabus notes that in this precedent-setting case, the court ruled that playing for money is not actually a necessary element of gambling.
Right.
And I am really struggling with the logic here. If money is not the defining factor, what is the difference between a criminal syndicate and a family playing a harmless game of mahjong with plastic chips during a Sunday reunion?
It's a great question.
How does the law differentiate a crime from a hobby if cash isn't the trigger?
So to understand the U.S. versus Raphael ruling, we have to look past the physical exchange of peso bills. We have to look at the inherent nature of the game being played. The court essentially argued that certain games are inherently games of chance designed solely for gambling purposes.
So it's about the design of the game.
Yes. The peril lies in the act of wagering something of value, which doesn't strictly have to be currency, on an outcome dictated entirely by luck rather than skill.
So it's about the psychological mechanism of the wager, not just the currency itself.
Exactly. But to fully answer your question about the friendly family mahjong game versus the syndicate, we need to look at a later law that amended these older decrees.
Okay, which law?
Republic Act 9287. It provides an incredibly clear philosophical roadmap for why the state cares so deeply about this.
It's found in the Declaration of Policy, right?
Yes. The state isn't just worried about people losing their pocket change. The state views illegal gambling as a systemic social cancer.
Let's unpack that Declaration of Policy, because the language the lawmakers use is incredibly potent.
It is very strong language.
They explicitly condemn illegal gambling because it has become, and this is a direct quote from the text, an influential factor in an individual's disregard for the value of dignified work, perseverance, and thrift.
That sentence right there is the absolute core of the state's argument. It is fundamentally a defense of the work ethic.
The state is essentially saying that gambling offers a dangerous illusion. It equates instant, unearned monetary gain with success.
Exactly.
And by doing so, it actively erodes the foundational societal values of hard work, long-term planning, and self-reliance.
The law takes the position that if a citizen believes they can change their economic destiny by just throwing a coin or picking a number, they will stop participating in the productive economy.
They'll just wait for the windfall.
Right. They will stop valuing labor. And so the instant gratification of gambling mutates into what the law calls a widespread social menace and a source of corruption.
Okay, so bringing it back to that family mahjong game.
Right.
The state doesn't care about your grandmother winning some plastic chips because that isolated event doesn't threaten the national work ethic.
Precisely. Grandma is safe.
Good to know. What the state is targeting, what these laws are built to destroy, is the systemic, organized promotion of this social menace.
Yes.
The syndicates aren't just taking money, they are selling a lifestyle that the state believes fundamentally undermines the fabric of a productive, functioning society.
That is precisely the philosophical stance. I mean, the criminal code is stepping far beyond just maintaining order on the street. It is legally mandating a specific value system.
Wow.
It is enforcing the idea that a society can only survive if its citizens value the dignity of labor over the lure of easy money.
And once you grasp that philosophy, you begin to understand why the state had to evolve its tactics.
Right, because the enemy evolved.
Exactly. Street-level games were one thing, but the syndicates running local lotteries had turned this social menace into a highly organized corporate structure.
Which brings us directly into the crosshairs of Republic Act number 9287.
This is the law where the state stops playing whack-a-mole with street gamblers.
Right.
And brings a massive structural hammer down on illegal numbers games.
Republic Act 9287 is a fascinating piece of legislation. It functions almost like an antitrust law, but for criminal syndicates.
How so?
It explicitly maps out the entire organizational chart of an illegal lottery, and it assigns escalating punishments based on a person's rung on that corporate ladder.
Before we climb that ladder, we really need to define the products these syndicates are selling.
Okay, let's define them.
The syllabus outlines 3 specific numbers games that dominate this space. First, there is Jueteng. For the uninitiated, how does Jueteng actually work on the ground?
So Jueteng is essentially an incredibly localized, informal lottery. The standard version involves a combination of 37 numbers paired against another 37 numbers.
Okay.
You place a bet on a 2-number combination. The draw usually happens locally, sometimes multiple times a day, often using numbered wooden balls drawn from a bottle or like a small rotating drum.
And why is it so popular?
The appeal is the extreme accessibility. Bets can be tiny, just a few pesos. That makes it completely ubiquitous in poorer communities.
Got it. Next on the list is Masiao. This is an interesting one because it relies on an external event, right?
Yes, Masiao is different. The winning combination in Masiao is derived from the results of Jaialai games.
Jaialai being the fast-paced sport with the walled court.
Right, but the syndicate uses the official results of those legitimate matches to determine the winners of their completely unregulated, illegal side betting operation.
So they just piggyback on it.
Exactly.
And finally, there is the last two. This is perhaps the most cynical of the bunch because it piggybacks directly on the government's own legal lottery.
It really is brilliant in a very dark way. The Philippine Charity Sweepstakes Office, or PCSO, runs daily legal televised draws.
Right, the official state lottery.
Yes, and the syndicates running the last two simply take bets on what the last 2 digits of the official PCSO winning ticket will be.
So they don't even have to run a draw themselves.
No overhead at all. They just siphon off the betting action into an illegal shadow economy using the government's own broadcast.
That is wild. And these aren't just casual games between friends. These are massive, deeply entrenched local economies moving millions of pesos completely outside the banking system.
And completely outside the tax net, which the state obviously hates.
Right. And RA 9287 dismantles them by attacking the structure. Let's walk through this hierarchy of penalties because the escalation is truly staggering.
It is. The law categorizes the participants into very specific roles.
So at the very bottom of the food chain, you have the bettor.
Yes. In the local terminology, this is the menonaya.
This is just the regular citizen placing a 20 peso bet on a street corner.
Right.
If you are caught simply placing a bet, the law is relatively lenient. The penalty is 30 to 90 days of imprisonment.
It's essentially a misdemeanor level punishment. The state recognizes the bettor as the consumer of the vice, not the architect of it.
That makes sense.
But take one single step up the ladder, and the legal landscape changes violently.
The next rung up is the personnel or staff, right?
Right. These are the runners who collect the bets, the checkers who tally the numbers, the lookouts, the guards.
And if you are caught acting as staff, the penalty instantly jumps. It jumps to 6 to 8 years in prison.
Yes, we go from a maximum of 90 days to a minimum of 6 years. That is a massive legislative leap.
It is a totally different universe of punishment.
The law is sending a very clear message here. The moment you transition from consuming the vice to facilitating the operation, you are an enemy of the state.
Okay, so above the runners, we enter middle management. This role is called the collector or agent.
Locally known as the cabo.
The cabo. They manage a group of runners in a specific neighborhood or barangay, right?
Yes, they consolidate the bets and the cash from the street level.
And the penalty for a cabo is 8 to 10 years in prison.
Right. And above the cabo is the coordinator or supervisor, often referred to as the encargado.
The encargado, what do they do?
This person manages multiple cabos across a much wider geographic area. So perhaps an entire town or a city district.
And for the encargado, the penalty scales up again to 10 to 12 years.
Exactly.
Now we are firmly in the territory of severe, life-altering felony conviction.
Oh, absolutely.
And we haven't even reached the top.
No, we haven't. Above the encargado is the C-suite of the syndicate, the maintainer, manager, or operator.
This is the person orchestrating the daily draws, managing the payouts, running the overall logistics.
Yes, and they face 12 to 14 years.
Okay. And alongside the operator is the financier or capitalist.
This is the individual banking the entire operation.
They provide the massive cash reserves required to cover the payouts, right? Like on days when the betting pool doesn't cover the winning numbers.
Exactly. They are the financial lifeblood of the syndicate, and their penalty is 14 to 16 years.
But there is one rung higher. The absolute top of this illegal corporate ladder isn't the person running the game or even the person funding it.
No, it's not.
It is the protector or coddler.
Yes, the protector. This is usually someone with significant influence, power, or authority in the community.
They use their position to shield the operation from law enforcement.
They provide the necessary corruption that allows the syndicate to breathe. Without them, the whole thing collapses.
So the protector receives the harshest baseline penalty in the law, 16 to 20 years in prison.
And the syllabus makes a massive, heavily bolded note right here regarding government officials.
Yes, I see that. If any of those upper management roles, the collector, supervisor, manager, financier, protector, is filled by a government employee, a police officer, or an elected official, the law just drops an anvil on them.
The penalty for a public official is completely maximized. They receive 12 to 20 years in prison, an astronomical fine ranging from 3 million to 5 million pesos.
Wow.
And most importantly, they face perpetual absolute disqualification from public office.
We really need to define perpetual absolute disqualification for anyone listening who might be unfamiliar with Philippine legal terminology.
Please do.
It means you are excised from public life forever.
Forever.
You lose your job. You forfeit your government pension. You can never be employed by the government again in any capacity.
Right.
And you can never run for any elected office, from local barangay captain all the way up to the presidency. It is a complete political death sentence.
It is the state completely severing you from the apparatus of power.
But I'm looking at these penalties. Up to 20 years in prison, total ruin for public officials.
Yeah.
And I have a serious logical question. The state has built a terrifying legal weapon here.
They have.
Why, then, does Republic Act 9287 also include extensive provisions for witness protection and an informer's reward system?
That is the million-dollar question.
I mean, if the threat of 20 years in a crowded prison is hanging over everyone's head, shouldn't that be enough of a deterrent? Why does the state need to bribe people to come forward?
Because the state understands the sociological reality of organized crime. Extremely high penalties, if applied in a vacuum, rarely dismantle syndicates. In fact, they often achieve the exact opposite result.
How so?
They build an impenetrable wall of silence.
Ah, the concept of omerta.
Precisely. Let's look at the Cabo, right? The middle manager facing 8 to 10 years.
Yeah.
If the police raid his house, he essentially has two options. Option A, he cooperates with law enforcement, he names the encargado and the capitalist, and he hopes for a lighter sentence.
This seems logical.
But he knows that if he does that, the syndicate's protector, who might literally be the local police chief or the town mayor, will ensure he is killed before he ever sees a courtroom.
Oh, wow. Okay, so option A is basically a death sentence.
Right. So look at option B. He keeps his mouth shut, he takes the 8-year sentence, and the syndicate takes care of his family financially while he is inside.
Ah, so the syndicate offers a perverse form of Social Security.
Exactly. The state realized that brute legal force was failing because the syndicate's leverage over its members was stronger than the state's threat of prison.
That makes total sense.
To break the operation, the state had to create a pressure release valve. They had to offer an incentive powerful enough to override the fear of death.
Enter the informer's reward.
Yes.
The law literally offers a massive financial bounty. If you blow the whistle on a Jueteng operation, the state will give you a percentage of all the confiscated cash and assets.
But money isn't enough if you're dead.
Right.
So the law explicitly ties this reward to the witness protection program.
It's a package deal.
It has to be. The state is actively entering a bidding war against the syndicate. They are saying to the lower level operators, we will not only drop your charges, but we will hide you, protect your family, and pay you a massive lump sum to start a new life if you give us the C-suite.
Give us the big fish.
Yes. It is a highly pragmatic acknowledgement that to destroy a criminal corporate structure, you need internal leverage. You need whistleblowers.
It is a brilliant, if somewhat grim, piece of legislative engineering.
Right.
I mean, the state recognizes the economic realities of vice and uses those exact same economic levers to tear it down.
It's fighting fire with fire.
But the state's war on public morals isn't confined to the shadow economy of numbers games, right?
Not at all.
When we flip to the next chapter of the syllabus you gave us, the focus shifts dramatically. We leave the world of syndicates and ledgers, and we enter the highly subjective, highly physical realm of public spaces.
Yes, we are moving into Chapter 2 of Title 6, Offenses Against Decency and Good Customs.
This is where the law becomes intensely interpretive.
Very much so. We are no longer dealing with the binary math of a betting slip. We are dealing with societal sensibilities.
We're dealing with concepts like grave scandal and obscenity.
Right?
Let's start with Article 200 of the Revised Penal Code, which defines grave scandal.
Okay.
The elements required to prove this crime are incredibly specific. First, the offender must perform an act that is highly scandalous.
Naturally.
Second, that act must deeply offend decency and good customs.
Right.
But the third element is the hinge upon which the entire concept rests. The act must have public exposure.
Yes, and the state is making a very deliberate distinction here. The criminal justice system is not policing your private morality.
What you do in your own home is your business.
Precisely. What you do behind locked doors, away from the eyes of the public, is largely beyond the reach of grave scandal. The crime is not the act itself. The crime is the disruption of the public's peace of mind.
It is about who is forced to witness the offense.
Yes.
And the case law provided in the syllabus illustrates this perfectly. Take the case of U.S. versus Samaniego.
This is a great one.
Let's narrate the facts here, because it literally sounds like the setup for a soap opera.
It really does.
You have a married woman who is habitually appearing in public places with her paramour.
Right.
They are carrying on a highly visible affair, and the community knows they are frequently sneaking into vacant houses together.
Everyone in town is talking about it.
Exactly. So the local authorities charge her with grave scandal, assuming her blatant infidelity is an affront to public morals.
But the court threw the charge out.
Why? I mean, everyone knew.
Because while their relationship was scandalous gossip, there was no actual scandalous act committed in public view. The community knew it was happening in the vacant houses, but nobody actually saw the physical acts. The lack of direct visual public exposure completely negated the crime of grave scandal.
Wow. Okay. And we see a similar logic applied in the case of U.S. versus Katterjee.
Yes.
In this instance, a scandalous act was performed inside a private house. However, it was witnessed by one person who happened to see it.
Right, a single witness.
And the court ruled that being seen by a single individual does not meet the threshold for a grave scandal.
The law requires wider publicity. The act must shock the conscience of the general public, not just a lone peeping Tom.
Which brings us to the most bizarre and yet perfectly illustrative scenario in this entire syllabus.
Oh, yes, I know what you're going to bring up.
It is a detail that beautifully highlights how strictly the law categorizes the nature of an offense. Let's play a game here.
Okay, I'm ready.
I'll describe this scenario, and I want to walk through how a normal person would categorize it versus how the law categorizes it.
Let's do it.
Imagine a person takes the remnants of a coconut shell, right?
Right.
They fill it with human excrement, and they intentionally scatter it across a public space.
Most people, if they witness that, would immediately call it a public scandal. I mean, it is vile, it is shocking, and it is happening right out in the open.
Exactly. I would assume the police would immediately charge the person with grave scandal.
It seems obvious.
But the syllabus specifically notes that this act does not qualify as grave scandal. The court ruled it is an entirely different crime.
Yes, it falls under Article 329.
Which is?
It is classified as malicious mischief.
How on earth is scattering human waste in public legally defined as mischief rather than a scandal? I don't get it.
It all comes back to the core elements of the law. Grave scandal requires the act to offend decency and good customs in a moral sense.
Okay, a moral sense.
Yes, it relates to chastity, modesty, and sexual morality. The coconut incident, while obviously disgusting, does not offend moral chastity.
Oh, I see.
The court viewed it structurally. The act was fundamentally an intentional defacement of a physical space. Therefore, the law categorizes it as property damage.
An attack on the physical environment.
Exactly, which is malicious mischief. It's not seen as an attack on the community's moral purity.
It's a brilliant, almost mathematical legal distinction. It forces law enforcement to define exactly what part of the social contract is being broken.
Right. Is it an attack on property or an attack on the soul of the community?
And speaking of the soul of the community, that leads us directly into Article 201, obscenity.
Yes. Obscenity is notoriously difficult to legislate.
Because the definition of what is obscene changes with every generation, right?
Exactly. What shocked a community in 1950 might just be a primetime television commercial in 2025.
So to solve this moving target, the syllabus highlights the foundational legal test established in the case of U.S. versus Cottinger.
The Cottinger test.
Yes. For any material, a book, a photograph, a film, to be legally classified as obscene, it must meet 3 specific criteria.
Let's go through them.
First, it must be offensive to chastity, decency, or delicacy. Second, it must have the tendency to deprave or corrupt those whose minds are open to immoral influences.
Which is a very broad net.
Very broad. And third, it must be shocking to ordinary and common sense.
The Cottinger test has been the bedrock of obscenity law. But what is truly fascinating is how the courts apply this test when commerce collides with art.
Right, the profit motive. The syllabus references the case of People versus GoPen.
Yes, this case establishes a critical boundary regarding motive.
The court in GoPen ruled that displaying pictures with even a slight degree of obscenity becomes a criminal act if the display is done for commercial purposes and not for the sake of art.
The law is basically carving out an exception for artistic expression, but it is dropping the hammer on profiteering.
So, if a gallery displays a nude sculpture, the context is artistic appreciation.
Right, that's fine. But if a storefront uses a highly suggestive, slightly obscene image merely to draw in paying customers from the street,
the motive changes from expression to exploitation.
Exactly. The moment you attempt to profit off the degradation of public morals, the state intervenes.
And the law is incredibly precise about how that material reaches the public. When it comes to written obscenity, the syllabus notes a crucial distinction.
What's that?
Mere authorship is not enough to secure a conviction.
Right. If you just sit in your house and you write a deeply obscene manuscript and you lock it in your desk drawer, you haven't committed a crime against public morals.
Because the public hasn't been exposed to it.
Exactly. To be convicted, you must author the material and knowingly allow its publication or distribution.
The criminality is triggered by the action of releasing the poison into the public bloodstream, so to speak.
Yes, and this focus on exploitation and distribution brings us to perhaps the most sensitive and profound area of this entire syllabus.
It really is. We need to examine how the legal concept of public morals intersects with extreme vulnerability.
Specifically regarding minors and citizens living in desperate poverty.
Over the last several decades, the Philippine legal system has undergone a massive philosophical shift in how it handles the vulnerable.
It's a very clear trajectory.
If we trace the timeline provided in the documents, a clear narrative of growing empathy actually emerges.
Which is a nice change of pace. Historically, laws regarding public morals often punish the victims of societal failure.
Right. But we see a stark reversal begin in 2012 with Republic Act 1-158.
RA 1-158 is a landmark piece of legislation because it officially decriminalized vagrancy.
For generations, vague laws against loitering or being without visible means of support were basically used to sweep the unhoused off the streets.
They were essentially criminalizing the state of being poor.
Yes. And following that trajectory, the state passed Republic Act 1862, which entirely repealed Article 202 of the revised Penal Code.
And Article 202 is a statute that historically criminalized prostitutes.
This repeal represents a tectonic shift in legal philosophy.
It really does. The state essentially made a definitive declaration. Being unhoused or being economically forced into survival sex work should not be prosecuted as a criminal offense against public morals.
The individuals suffering these conditions are not the enemies of decency.
No, they are casualties of a flawed economic system.
However, this decriminalization of the vulnerable is fiercely contrasted with the terrifying severity the state reserves for those who exploit them.
This is where Republic Act 7610 comes into play.
Yes, the special protection of children against abuse, exploitation, and discrimination.
The penalties outlined in RA 7610 regarding child prostitution and child obscenity are crushing.
Literally crushing. If you hire, employ, use, persuade, or coerce a child to perform in obscene exhibitions, you are facing prison in its medium to maximum periods.
We are talking about years and years in a federal penitentiary.
And the law includes an aggravating circumstance. If the child involved is under the age of 12, the penalty is automatically pushed to its absolute maximum limit.
Right. But the most important legal distinction in RA 7610, the detail that perfectly encapsulates this philosophical shift, is found in Section 5.
Let's talk about Section 5.
The law explicitly mandates that a child engaged in prostitution or obscene exhibitions is legally, unequivocally treated as a victim and never as an offender.
And the syllabus notes that the concept of habituality, meaning defense attorneys cannot argue that the child consented because they had done it multiple times before, is entirely irrelevant.
Irrelevant. The child cannot be prosecuted regardless of their gender or history. The entire weight of the law falls on the adult exploiter.
The state is drawing a hard line. Vulnerability cannot be criminalized, but the exploitation of vulnerability will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law.
Exactly.
Which brings us back to the scenario we opened the show with. We have established that the state wants to protect the vulnerable. We have established that the state wants to punish the exploiters. But when we look at Presidential Decree 1563, known as the Mendicancy Law, this protective philosophy is stretched to an incredibly uncomfortable, almost paradoxical limit.
The mendicancy law forces us to confront the dark reality of how street economies operate.
The law begins by carefully differentiating between vagrancy and mendicancy.
Yes.
Vagrancy, which as we discussed is now decriminalized, is simply the state of wandering without visible means of support.
Right.
Mendicancy, however, is defined as the act of begging or soliciting alms as a means of living.
And here is the jarring reality of the law. While the state understands the desperation of the beggar, it aggressively criminalizes the act of abetting mendicancy.
This means that if you are walking across that bridge and you hand a coin or a bill or even an item of value directly to a beggar or an exploited minor on a public road, sidewalk, park, or bridge,
you are literally breaking the law.
You are committing a crime.
The law does provide an exception, though. You are legally encouraged to give alms, but it must be done through organized, qualified charitable agencies.
Like religious institutions or government welfare boards.
Exactly.
Let's just sit with this for a moment, because it feels entirely counterintuitive to basic human nature.
It does.
When you see someone starving in front of you, the impulse is immediate triage. You have a resource, they have a need. You bridge the gap.
It's instinct.
To criminalize the direct transfer of a crime feels cold. It feels like the state is treating the symptom, the visible poverty on the street, while ignoring the disease.
It is an incredibly uncomfortable law to digest. I mean, it really is.
How do they justify it?
Well, to understand the state's logic, we have to connect the mendicancy law to everything we just discussed regarding the jutang syndicates and child exploitation.
Okay, so the state is not criminalizing your empathy.
No. The government is essentially saying your empathy is being weaponized.
Weaponized by who?
By the syndicates. The state's research and all their law enforcement data show that street mendicancy is rarely an individual enterprise.
It's not just one person trying to get by.
No, it is a highly organized territorial industry. When you hand a 50 peso bill to a child begging at an intersection, you aren't buying that child a meal.
You're not.
The law assumes, based on vast evidence, that there is a syndicate boss or an abusive trafficker waiting around the corner in the shadows.
Oh, wow.
The moment you drive away, that 50 peso bill goes directly into the pocket of the exploiter.
The child is just the bait.
Exactly. The syndicates know that a hungry child generates vastly more revenue than an adult. It is an industry built entirely on extracting immediate emotional generosity from the public.
And Presidential Decree 603 and RA 7610 severely punish the parents or adults who force these children into the streets.
Right. But the state realized they couldn't just arrest their way out of the problem if the enterprise remained highly profitable.
So by criminalizing the giver, the state is attempting to starve the exploiter.
That is the grim, pragmatic calculus of the mendicancy law. The state is telling its citizens, if you want to help, funnel your money through audited, organized charities that can actually provide systemic rehabilitation.
Do not fuel the street-level economy of exploitation with your spare change.
Yes. It is a harsh logic, but it aligns perfectly with their war on the Juateng overlords.
It's the exact same tactic.
Whether it is illegal lotteries or forced begging, the state's ultimate tactic is to sever the syndicate's financial pipeline.
It is a profound realization that the coin in your pocket is a piece of a much larger puzzle involving organized crime, child protection, and public morals.
It really is. Everything is connected.
We have seen how the state exerts control over the physical reality of its cities. We've seen how they manage the street corners, the local barangay lotteries, and the public spaces.
Right.
But all of this legislation is fundamentally rooted in a physical geography. The crime happens in a specific place, involving specific people you can touch and arrest.
Which sets the stage for the most monumental shift in this entire stack of documents you gave us.
Yes, the 2025 paradigm shift.
Because what happens when the vice escapes the street corner? What happens when the syndicate isn't running numbers out of the local hall, but is instead operating massive, internet-connected, multi-story corporate hubs catering to a global, invisible audience?
The rules of the game completely shatter.
They absolutely do.
We are now opening Republic Act number 12312, officially known as the Anti-PO Act of 2025.
This is the moment where the local, century-old laws on public morals collide head-on with the borderless reality of international cyberspace.
This act is not a surgical legal adjustment. It is a masterclass in sweeping, aggressive, scorched earth legislation.
Oh, yeah. To understand why the state dropped such a massive hammer, we first have to clearly define the target. We need to understand what an offshore gaming hub actually is.
Okay, Section 3 of the Act provides the technical definition.
Let's hear them.
It defines offshore gaming as the offering of, or participating in, online games of chance or sporting events via the internet.
Okay, standard online gambling.
Right. But crucially, it involves using local networks, software, and physical facilities located inside the Philippines. But the betting platforms cater exclusively to offshore players.
Meaning foreign nationals located outside the country.
Exact.
This model existed because of regulatory arbitrage. Syndicates and gaming corporations set up massive physical infrastructures in the Philippines, renting entire skyscrapers, laying miles of fiber optic cables, importing thousands of IT workers.
This is a massive industry.
Huge. They built these hubs in the Philippines to take advantage of local internet infrastructure and historically lenient zoning. But the actual gambling, the flow of money from bettors, came from countries where online gambling was strictly prohibited.
The law meticulously defines the entire ecosystem of this industry to ensure there are no loopholes. It targets the PO-Joes themselves, the Philippine offshore gaming operators who hold the master licenses.
Right.
It targets the PO hubs, which are the physical residential or commercial buildings. These are often massive self-contained compounds housing these operations.
And it doesn't stop there. The law defines and targets the POJO-accredited service providers.
What are those?
These are the ancillary businesses, the customer service call centers, the digital marketing firms, the IT tech support teams.
Oh.
And finally, it targets the POJO gaming content providers, the actual studios streaming the live casino data or sports feeds.
The state literally maps out the entire digital supply chain. And then, in Section 4, the law delivers an absolute, unequivocal ban. It outlaws the entire ecosystem.
There is no regulation here, no increased taxation, no compromise. It is a total wipeout.
Let me read the breadth of Section 4 because it is staggering. It is explicitly prohibited to establish or operate any form of offshore gaming.
Okay.
It is prohibited to act as a content provider. It is prohibited to create or manage a POJO hub. But here is where the law really shows its teeth. It is even prohibited to merely possess POJO gaming equipment or specialized paraphernalia within the territory of the Philippines.
The mere possession of the server racks customized for offshore gaming becomes a criminal offense.
Wow. But the most potent, far-reaching part of Section 4 is what we can call the aiding and abetting net.
Yes. The state clearly learned its lesson from the decades spent fighting the Joetang syndicates.
Right. They realized you can't just arrest the runners.
You have to destroy the infrastructure that allows the syndicate to breathe. The law recognizes that a multi-billion-dollar digital hub doesn't exist in a vacuum. It requires real estate, legal cover, and human logistics.
So the act casts an incredibly wide net of criminal liability over the legitimate economy that serviced these hubs.
This is where it gets terrifying for the business sector.
Give me an example.
If you are a corporate lawyer and you register a shell company to conceal the true ownership of a POGO, you are no longer just facing disbarment. You are committing a federal crime under this act.
Oh, wow.
If you are a local fixer providing spurious IDs, fake birth certificates, or fraudulent passports to foreign POGO workers, you are criminalized.
It extends to the real estate market, too. If you are a commercial landlord and you knowingly lease a building, a warehouse, or even a fleet of vehicles to an entity engaging in offshore gaming, you are aiding and abetting. You are liable.
And crucially, the law specifically targets the borders.
How so?
It explicitly outlaws the act of facilitating or helping in the illegal exit and entry of persons at airports or seaports for POGO-related activities.
So they are targeting the corrupt immigration officials who are waving these workers through passport control.
Yes. They are attacking the real estate, the bureaucracy, and the national borders all simultaneously. It is a coordinated siege on the industry's logistics.
But, I'm struggling with the math here. I'm going to act as the skeptic for a moment on behalf of our listener who is looking at the economics of this ban.
Okay, let's hear the skeptic's argument.
The law specifically states that these POJOs cater strictly to offshore players. The local citizens of the Philippines are not the ones logging on, placing bets, and losing their life savings. Right. The social menace of easy money that RA 9287 warned about isn't infecting the local Bernanges in this specific scenario.
That is the paradox, on paper at least.
Right. So from a purely cynical macroeconomic standpoint, foreign players are pumping foreign money into the Philippine economy. They are paying massive commercial rents to local landlords. They are paying inflated salaries to local IT workers.
They are buying local electricity and food.
Exactly. Why would the Philippine government use this massive legal hammer to nuke a multi-billion-dollar foreign cash injection? What was the hidden cost that triggered this total ban?
To answer that, we have to connect the specific mechanics of the ban to the broader, much darker context explicitly outlined in the opening pages of the Act. We have to look at Section 2, the Declaration of Policy. Notice what is actually missing from that declaration.
What's missing?
It doesn't primarily talk about the moral evils of gambling or the defense of the work ethic like the older laws did.
It talks about something much more immediate. I have it here. The policy explicitly states its goal is the maintenance of peace and order, the protection of life, liberty, and property, and the full respect for human rights.
And then you turn to Section 9 of the Act, which is the absolute smoking gun.
Yes, Section 9 explicitly tackles human trafficking.
Right. It bans the recruitment, transportation, or harboring of any Filipino or foreign national for offshore gaming, classifying it under the expanded Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act.
The state realized that a digital crime still requires a physical footprint. and that footprint had become highly toxic.
Exactly. The offshore nature of the betting did absolutely nothing to mitigate the onshore crime.
Right.
The government discovered that these massive POGO hubs had ceased to be just mundane IT call centers. They had mutated into heavily guarded vectors for systemic transnational corruption.
We are talking about syndicates bribing local officials to secure building permits. We are talking about the mass production of fraudulent passports and the systemic corruption of immigration checkpoints to import thousands of undocumented workers.
But the darkest reality was the human trafficking. Law enforcement raids on these hubs revealed that thousands of foreign nationals and many locals were essentially trapped inside these self-contained compounds.
Trapped.
Yes. Their passports were confiscated, their movements were severely restricted, and they were forced to run digital scams and facilitate illegal gaming operations under threat of physical violence.
Oh my.
The hubs literally became sovereign criminal states operating within the borders of the Philippines.
So the physical footprint of this borderless digital crime became too destructive to the fabric of local society to ignore.
Yes. The state realized that the so-called free money was coming at the unacceptable cost of peace, order, and basic human rights. The infection of corruption and trafficking was just too deep to treat with regulation or higher taxes.
They had to amputate the entire industry.
Which brings us to an incredible logistical dilemma.
Right.
Because banning a massive, deeply entrenched, multi-billion-dollar international industry on a piece of paper is one thing.
It's just words on paper until you enforce it.
Yeah. But how does a government physically enforce an eviction notice on that massive scale? How do you dismantle that infrastructure overnight without plunging the local economy into complete chaos and leaving thousands of workers stranded?
This is where we see the hammer drop. The enforcement mechanisms detailed in this law outline a terrifyingly efficient bureaucratic wipeout.
It's surgical.
Under Section 5, the law mandates the immediate revocation of all licenses, and it names the specific agencies that must pull the plug.
First is PAGCOR, the Philippine Amusement and Gaming Corporation. This is the government entity that originally issued the licenses and regulated the industry. PAGCOR is ordered to instantly cancel every offshore master license.
Next is TIZA, the Tourism Infrastructure and Enterprise Zone Authority, along with all the various regional special economic zones.
These zones had previously offered tax incentives and streamlined zoning for POJOs to build their massive hubs.
Right, and the law mandates that these authorities revoke all permits, effectively making the physical buildings illegal to operate.
But the administrative strike goes deeper into the corporate structure itself. The law targets the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Okay.
Any registered corporation in the country that lists offshore gaming as part of its primary or secondary purpose in its articles of incorporation is put on a ticking clock.
They have exactly 30 days to legally amend their corporate purpose.
Yes, 30 days. And if they fail to do so, the SEC is mandated to automatically revoke their certificate of registration, dissolving the company entirely.
It is a coordinated multi-agency strike designed to strip the industry of any legal cover. And this bureaucratic purge extends immediately to the human element as well, the borders and the workforce.
Yes. Section 6 deals with the massive influx of foreign workers who staffed these hubs.
Right.
It mandates that the Department of Labor and Employment and the Bureau of Immigration must permanently and immediately cancel all alien employment permits and working visas related to POGO operations.
The law states that these foreign nationals are to be summarily deported to their country of birth or citizenship. The government is essentially chartering planes to clear the hubs.
But there is a massive, incredibly important caveat written into the law regarding deportation.
Yes, the no free ride clause.
I love that name. The law explicitly states that if a foreign national working in a POGO is found to have committed a crime under Philippine law, whether that is human trafficking, fraud, or serious immigration violations, criminal prosecution takes absolute precedence over deportation.
You do not get a free flight home just because the industry was banned.
No, you will stay, you will face trial, and you will serve time in a Philippine penitentiary before you are ever allowed to leave.
The state is ensuring that the syndicates can't just pack up and move to another country with zero consequences for the crimes committed on local soil.
Exactly. But perhaps the most fascinating, almost ruthless mechanism of this shutdown is found in Section 7. This is the tax clause.
Oh, Section 7 is my absolute favorite part of this legislation. I compare it to a very specific scenario. Okay, give me the scenario.
Imagine you have a tenant renting an apartment.
Yeah.
And they are throwing illegal, destructive parties every night, just tearing the place apart. As the landlord, you finally kick them out. You're throwing their furniture on the lawn, you're changing the locks, and you're banning them from the premises forever.
Get out.
But right as they are walking to their car to leave, you stop them, you hand them a clipboard, and you make absolutely sure they pay their final utility bill and a massive inflated cleaning fee before they can drive away.
That analogy perfectly captures the spirit of Section 7. It is the ultimate legal catch-22.
Right.
The law clearly states that despite their master licenses being revoked, despite their operations being entirely banned and criminalized, these offshore gaming operators are still legally liable for all taxes, duties, and regulatory fees up to their very last day of operation.
They are stripping the industry of its legality, but forcefully retaining its tax liability. Yes, and the law mandates that the BIR, the Bureau of Internal Revenue, the National Tax Agency, will conduct a final audit on these syndicates to ensure every last peso owed to the government is extracted before the doors are padlocked.
It is a brilliant administrative chokehold. And if anyone attempts to defy this shutdown, if a syndicate tries to take their operations underground and continue running the servers in secret, the criminal penalties represent an extreme escalation from the old days of street gambling.
Absolutely. We talked earlier about the Judatang operators facing 12 to 14 years.
Right.
Under the Anti-PUGO Act, the baseline penalty for a first offense of operating an illegal hub is 6 to 12 years in prison. But it is the financial penalties that truly reflect the scale of the target.
The fines range from 15 million to an astronomical 50 million pesos.
And crucially, the law pierces the corporate veil. Syndicates often hide behind layers of shell companies, assuming that if the company gets caught, the corporation goes bankrupt, but the executives walk away clean.
Not anymore. The Anti-PUGO Act explicitly states that if the offender is a corporation, the responsible officers, the CEO, the president, the board of directors, are held personally, criminally liable.
They cannot hide behind a boardroom door. The law mandates no probation is allowed. It mandates the total forfeiture of all assets, bank accounts, and properties connected to the operation.
It requires the physical destruction of all confiscated POGO servers and gaming equipment.
And echoing the older anti-gambling laws, if a government official is caught protecting a POGO or aiding in their logistics, they face the absolute maximum penalty, immediate dismissal from service, and the total forfeiture of their retirement benefits.
The state built a machine designed to grind the industry into dust.
They really did.
But as you dismantle an industry of this scale, you generate massive collateral damage. Banning the syndicates solves the crime problem, but it creates a massive employment problem.
That is the tragic reality of these hubs.
Thousands of local Filipino citizens, IT workers, janitors, security guards, caterers suddenly find themselves unemployed overnight as these massive skyscrapers go dark.
So, how does the law address that economic shockwave? It addresses it in Section 10, which outlines the Filipino Workers Transition Program.
Okay, what is that?
The law mandates that a coalition of government agencies, specifically a DOLE, TESDA, which is the Technical Education and Skills Development Authority, and the DICT, the Department of Information and Communications Technology, must immediately formulate plans to reskill, upskill, and transition the displaced local workforce into legitimate sectors of the economy.
But I know you have serious reservations about the reality of this mandate.
I do. On paper, it sounds incredibly compassionate.
Right.
But practically,
Yeah.
I have to question if this transition program is realistic or if it is just a legislative band-aid to soften the PR blow of a mass layoff.
Because the money was so good in the PO industry?
Exactly. You are taking thousands of people out of highly lucrative, albeit ultimately illegal, international tech sector. Because POJOs were swimming in unregulated cash, the salaries they paid to local IT and support staff were often vastly inflated compared to the standard local market rates.
Right, they were overpaying to keep people quiet and compliant.
Yes. So trying to task TESDA, a vocational training agency, with reskilling these workers and somehow matching that previous economic output seems like an incredibly tall order, if not an impossible one.
It is undeniably a massive, perhaps unprecedented bureaucratic and economic challenge. The government is absorbing the shock of a collapsed bubble.
Right.
But to understand why the state is legally mandating this rehabilitation effort, rather than just letting the free market sort out the unemployed, we have to look at how the law categorizes these workers.
It goes back to the philosophical categorization of victimhood that we saw earlier.
Exactly. Look at the structure of the act. By making POGO operations a predicate offense for anti-money laundering under Section 8, and by officially categorizing the recruitment of personnel under the expanded Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act in Section 9.
The state is making a profound legal declaration about everyone inside those buildings.
They are saying that the workers on the floor, both the foreign nationals who were trafficked in and the domestic IT workers who took the jobs for the inflated salaries, are not viewed by the law as co-conspirators in an illegal international gambling syndicate.
The law classifies them as potential victims of a larger transnational organized crime apparatus.
It perfectly, beautifully echoes the legal philosophy we saw earlier in the syllabus regarding the child protection laws and the Mendicancy Act.
The foundational strategy remains identical across decades of lawmaking. Punish the syndicate, punish the exploiters, punish the corrupt officials.
But attempt to rehabilitate, protect, and transition the vulnerable workforce that was caught in the machine.
Yes. And to ensure this massive unwinding actually happens, the law creates a final mechanism, the Administrative Oversight Committee.
This isn't just a single agency, right?
No, it is essentially a war council. It brings together the PAOCC, the Presidential Anti-Organized Crime Commission, the DOJ, the DICT, and the DLG.
So Justice, Tech, and Interior all working together.
Yes. The law mandates real-time data sharing and high-level enforcement across all these branches. They view this not as a simple zoning or regulatory issue, but as a multi-front war on organized crime.
And that realization brings this entire deep dive full circle.
It really does.
We started today looking at a syllabus, a stack of legal documents that felt like a chaotic, disconnected list of rules. We called it diagnostic muddy waters.
Right.
But when you lay all these documents out chronologically and analyze the philosophy behind them, a very clear, continuous narrative emerges.
It is the narrative of a legal system locked in an endless foot race, constantly running to catch up with the evolving, mutating nature of human vice.
We tracked it from the very beginning. We saw the state dropping hyper-specific bans on simple street games like Car y Cruz, driven by a deep anxiety about the moral decay of the local neighborhood and the erosion of the work ethic.
We watched the vice organize, and we saw the law respond to the corporate ladder of Jiteng, inventing entirely new mechanisms like informer rewards and witness protection just to break the impenetrable silence of the syndicates.
We saw how the law struggled to define physical decency, drawing strict lines between moral outrage and property damage in the case of the coconut shell.
We witnessed the profound philosophical shift from criminalizing the poor and the vagrant to recognizing them as victims of exploitation,
culminating in the jarring reality of criminalizing the giving of alms just to starve the traffickers.
And finally, we arrived at the sweeping, unprecedented 2025 ban on digital POGO hubs. We saw a state realize with horror that a seemingly borderless digital vice could manifest as deeply physical, deeply destructive human trafficking and corruption right on their own shores.
For you, the learner listening to this, the ultimate takeaway is a reminder that these laws do not just exist in a vacuum.
No, they don't.
They aren't just dry text on a syllabus or a newly printed Republic Act filed away in a government archive. They are the invisible architecture of your reality.
They dictate the shape of your cities, determining which skyscrapers are built and which are padlocked.
They dictate the economy of your streets, determining whether handing a coin to a starving person on a bridge is an act of celebrated charity or a punishable criminal offense.
And as we move forward, they dictate the boundaries of your digital world. They are the blunt instruments society uses to define exactly what it values and exactly what it fears.
But the evolution we've tracked today is far from over. The syndicates never stop innovating.
Never. They are always one step ahead.
Which is why I want to leave you with a final thought today. Something to mull over that builds on everything we've unpacked, but looks just over the horizon.
Okay, what is it?
The massive 2025 Anti-PICO Act focuses intensely on physical infrastructure. It targets physical hubs, residential buildings, server racks, and computer equipment located physically within the borders of the Philippines.
Right, it targets physical things.
It targets the physical trafficking of human bodies through airports. But technology is moving faster than legislation. As virtual reality becomes indistinguishable from physical reality, and as fully decentralized blockchain technologies make server locations irrelevant, what happens next?
Oh, wow. What happens when the next generation of global gambling syndicates has no physical hub to raid?
Exactly. What happens when there is no centralized server to unplug, no physical equipment to seize and destroy, and no geographic border at all?
how will a state enforce its public morals?
How will it protect its citizens from the social menace when the crime exists in a digital space the law cannot physically reach?
That is the ultimate challenge for the next generation of lawmakers. The diagnostic muddy waters are only going to get deeper and much darker.
We will leave you to think on that. Thank you for handing us this incredible stack of documents, and thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Welcome to the debate. Today we are examining a pretty massive rupture in how the state handles illicit gambling.
Right, it's a completely different landscape now.
Exactly. We're tracing this trajectory from traditional statutes, older laws that were basically designed to police public morals, all the way to the absolute unyielding prohibition mandated by the newly enacted Anti-Pogo Act of 2025.
Which is Republic Act number 13212, for those keeping track.
Yeah, exactly. So historically, fighting illegal gambling was kind of like playing whack-a-mole with local neighborhood games. You find a small parlor, you shut it down.
Very localized.
Right. But today, the state isn't dealing with a card game in a back alley. It is dealing with heavily fortified digital syndicates. So the state essentially decided to stop playing whack-a-mole and just, simply cut the power lines to the entire arcade.
And I would say that in cutting those power lines, the state has plunged legitimate businesses, constitutional rights, and fundamental legal principles straight into the dark.
Well, that brings us to the central question we're exploring today. Does the Anti-Pogo Act represent a necessary, proportionate legal evolution to protect national security and combat transnational crime? Or does its draconian nature, the blanket bans, the summary deportations, the absolute license revocations, does all of that represent a heavy-handed departure from the nuanced, graduated regulatory framework of our traditional penal laws?
And we're grounding this discourse heavily in the statutes themselves, right? Looking at older laws like Presidential Decree No. 1602 and Republic Act No. 9287, and juxtaposing those against the actual text of this new Anti-Pogo Act.
Spot on. So I argue that the Anti-PGO Act is a vital and proportionate legislative response to a complex transnational threat that just renders traditional regulation entirely obsolete.
And I argue that the act is a blunt, disproportionate overreach that abandons essential legal nuance in favor of extreme absolute prohibition.
Okay, so we have to start with the fundamental intent behind the legislation here. If you trace the history of traditional penal frameworks like Republic Act 9287, which increased penalties for illegal numbers games, the state's philosophy was really entirely focused on managing local public morals.
Right, policing activities like jueteng.
Exactly. And for those unfamiliar, jueteng is essentially an analog grassroots lottery. A local collector walks around a neighborhood, gathers small coins from residents, writes numbers on a slip of paper.
Very low tech.
Disregard for the value of dignified work. The state was acting almost like a paternalistic guardian, concerned that people were relying on instant monetary gains rather than thrift and hard work. It was a very localized social intervention.
Yeah, and it was a system built on measuring the specific social harm of an idle vice and calibrating the response to that specific vice.
Sure, but that rationale is completely useless today because the threat has mutated. Philippine offshore gaming operators, or POGOs, are not a local moral issue. We aren't talking about idle vices here.
Well, no one is denying the scale is different.
Right, but the Anti-Pogo Act addresses severe structural threats to the very integrity of the state. We're talking about syndicates that have literally weaponized the digital space. The new act explicitly links these operations to high-level money laundering and human trafficking.
Under the Anti-Money Laundering Act. Yes.
Exactly. This is how the mechanism works. Illicit funds from global syndicates are brought into the country, mixed with legitimate offshore gambling losses via cryptocurrency gateways, and then transferred out completely clean. It is an industrial-scale laundering machine.
The mechanics of it are undeniably sophisticated.
So when you're dealing with a transnational network operating within your borders, the absolute ban established in Section 4 and the immediate revocation of licenses from the state gaming regulator PatchCore, they are completely justified. You cannot regulate a multi-billion-dollar laundering syndicate. You just have to eradicate it.
I frame the issue entirely differently. Look, While the state's sudden concern regarding transnational crime is valid, the mechanism it has chosen sacrifices the absolute bedrock of legal proportionality.
How so?
Well, traditional frameworks, for all their paternalism, were remarkably sophisticated in how they applied justice. They recognized that a syndicate is made up of different actors with vastly different levels of culpability.
Right, the graduated penalties.
Exactly. Under the old laws regulating illegal numbers games, the penalties were strictly graduated. A mere bettor faced, 30 to 90 days of imprisonment? A collector or agent faced 8 to 10 years. A capitalist or financier faced 14 to 16 years. The law understood that passing coins to a neighbor is fundamentally different from financing an illegal enterprise.
But that's because the traditional enterprise was simple enough to dismantle piece by piece.
Even so, the complexity of the enterprise does not excuse the state from its obligation to dispense proportional justice. The Anti-Pogo Act just abandons that graduation entirely. It wields a sledgehammer.
I wouldn't call it a sledgehammer.
But it is. Under Section 13, a first offense carries a massive flat minimum penalty of 6 to 8 years imprisonment, plus a 15 million peso fine. And that draconian minimum applies regardless of whether the offender is a mastermind establishing a massive pogo hub or a lower-level actor who merely introduces gaming equipment into the country.
Well, they're part of the same supply chain.
But by permanently revoking all existing licenses overnight and mandating massive administrative sweeps, the state is acting with an unprecedented bluntness. It's really the complete erasure of legal nuance.
I find that framing deeply flawed, honestly, because you are applying an analog standard of nuance to a digital fortress. What you view as administrative bluntness is actually a highly calibrated mechanism to dismantle a completely different type of infrastructure.
Calibrated? It bans everything.
Let's consider the sheer scope of Section 4 of the Anti-Pogo Act. It doesn't just prohibit the operation of the games. It bans creating hubs, acting as a gaming content provider, or even leasing property to pogos. It criminalizes the entire supply chain.
Which is precisely my concern. It basically creates a dragnet that catches standard legitimate businesses.
It has to cast a wide net, though, because of how these syndicates operate. We aren't talking about a back room with a card table. We are talking about 30-story commercial towers outfitted with military-grade servers, independent power grids, biometric access controls.
I understand the scale, but
a pogo relies on a massive logistical footprint, Spurious passports, residential leases for thousands of workers, commercial IT networks. You cannot just bandage that. You have to cut the life support systems.
Even if it means catching the innocent landlord?
That is exactly why Section 11 creates an administrative oversight committee led by the Presidential Anti-Organized Crime Commission. The state recognized that standard local police cannot dismantle a fortified digital city. It requires a specialized organized crime task force.
But wait, if you widen the net to catch every piece of infrastructure, you inevitably trap innocent actors. Let's actually look at how the text of the law handles intent.
Okay, let's look at it.
In the older framework under Presidential Decree number 1602, the law was precise. It punished, knowingly possessing without lawful purpose gambling paraphernalia. It required the state to prove that the person holding the equipment knew what it was being used for. It protected the innocent courier or the uninformed landlord.
Or it created a convenient loophole for willful ignorance.
I disagree. It protected the presumption of innocence. Now, contrast that with Section 4 of the Anti-Pogo Act. It criminalizes the mere introduction, use, or possession of pogo gaming equipment. It completely strips away those knowingly and without lawful purpose qualifiers.
Because the context has changed.
But pogo equipment is defined incredibly broadly as computers, software, and ICT devices used in offshore gaming. Do you see the danger here? If you are a standard commercial IT supplier delivering server racks or a real estate developer leasing commercial office space, the lack of careful legal qualifiers puts you at massive risk of overcriminalization.
I think you are ignoring the scale of these operations, really. The law is not prosecuting a landlord for renting out a single apartment to someone who happens to code for a pogo.
The text doesn't make that distinction.
But Section 4 specifically contextualizes these acts as aiding, protecting, or abetting the conduct of offshore gaming. If a real estate developer is leasing an entire tower block to an entity that immediately installs encrypted servers behind steel doors, claiming ignorance is no longer a viable legal defense.
That's a massive leap to make legally, though.
The sheer scale of these operations makes willful blindness a form of active complicity. What the state is doing is forcing property owners and IT providers to perform rigorous due diligence. It puts the onus on the private sector to stop turning a blind eye to syndicates just because the lease payments are incredibly lucrative. That is how you starve an organized crime syndicate of its resources.
Well, that assumes a level of perfect execution and perfect judgment by the authorities, which history proves is a fantasy. When you lower the threshold for criminality, you just increase the potential for abuse.
I don't think it's lowering the threshold.
It absolutely is. And this brings us to an even more alarming consequence of this legal dragnet: the human collateral damage. If you apply that same aggressive logic to the labor force, the contradictions in the law become glaring.
You're talking about Section 6?
Yes, let's analyze Section 6. It mandates the withdrawal and permanent cancellation of all visas for persons employed by POGOs or their service providers. It explicitly directs the Bureau of Immigration to ensure these foreign nationals are deported directly to their country of birth.
Right, which cuts off the specialized labor supply that keeps the servers running.
But it treats every single foreign worker as a criminal to be summarily expelled. And here is the fatal contradiction within the text of the Act itself. Section 9 explicitly acknowledges that human trafficking is rampant within these operations.
Yes, under the expanded Anti-Trafficking in Persons Act.
Exactly. So the state formally recognizes the mechanism of this crime. People are lured from overseas with fake job advertisements for legitimate IT or customer service roles. When they arrive, their passports are confiscated by armed guards, they're trapped inside these massive hubs, and they are forced into labor, often running cryptocurrency scams alongside the gambling.
It's horrific, yes.
The state knows they are victims, yet Section 6 mandates their immediate deportation. How do you reconcile a law that simultaneously identifies a group as victims of a transnational trafficking syndicate and then processes them with the blunt instrument of summary expulsion?
Because you are entirely missing the safety valves explicitly engineered into the legislation. Section 6 is not a blind, sweeping deportation mandate.
Really? Because it says immediate cancellation.
It does. But the final proviso of Section 6 states verbatim, provided finally that prosecution and punishment for crimes committed by such foreign nationals shall take precedence over an action for deportation.
Right. Which just means the state can hold them if they want to charge them.
It means the state recognizes the tactics of the syndicate. The architects of this law anticipated that the masterminds, the individuals actually orchestrating the trafficking rings and the money laundering, would try to use deportation as an escape hatch.
Oh, I see where you're going.
Exactly. When a hub is raided, a syndicate boss would much rather be deported back to a jurisdiction where they have influence than face the Philippine justice system. That proviso ensures that actual criminals face justice before they are expelled.
That still leaves the victims being deported summarily, though.
But furthermore, when we evaluate the human impact, we cannot ignore how the law protects the domestic workforce. Section 10 establishes the Filipino Workers Transition Program,
which is a mandate for the labor departments to step in, right?
Yes. The state is not blind to the economic shock of suddenly shuttering an industry that employed tens of thousands of local citizens in administrative and support roles. The law legally mandates the Department of Labor and Employment, along with the Skills Authority, TESTA, to rescale and upskill affected citizens.
True. That is in the text.
The state is actively funding their transition into legitimate tech sectors. So this proves the law balances strict, uncompromising enforcement against foreign syndicates with a comprehensive domestic social welfare program.
Okay, look, providing a safety net for domestic citizens is certainly necessary, but it does not excuse the erosion of due process for everyone else. And that actually brings me to what I consider the most dangerous legal precedent set by this evolution.
Let me guess. Asset seizure?
Yes. Corporate accountability and the terrifying expansion of state power in the realm of asset seizure under Section 15.
I argue that the accountability mechanisms are the absolute strongest features of the Act. They finally give the state teeth.
Well, let's examine how sharp those teeth are. First, I will concede that Section 13 aggressively scales up accountability for corporate officers. If a corporation violates the act, the president, CEO, and board members are held personally liable.
Exactly.
And Section 14 imposes the maximum penalty, dismissal and forfeiture of retirement benefits on public officials who are complicit.
Which builds perfectly on the older frameworks. Under the old laws, local officials who tolerated illegal numbers games faced perpetual disqualification from public office. Section 14 takes that principle and applies it to the massive financial power of digital syndicates.
Right.
If a local mayor is found providing protection to a pogo hub, they lose their career and their pension. It deters systemic corruption.
And holding corrupt public officials accountable is essential. I'm not arguing against that. But look closely at Section 15, specifically the provisions regarding civil forfeiture.
Okay.
It states that independent of a criminal case, any property, tool, or asset used for the commission of prohibited acts shall be subject to civil forfeiture upon finding of probable cause.
Right. It allows the state to seize the assets used to facilitate the crime.
It allows the state to seize assets based on a notoriously low evidentiary bar. Probable cause simply means a prosecutor has convinced a judge that a crime likely happened based on preliminary reports. It completely bypasses the standard requirement of a full criminal conviction.
But waiting for a conviction takes years.
In traditional gambling jurisprudence, the confiscation of proceeds and paraphernalia required a conviction. The state had to prove beyond a reasonable doubt in a court of law that a crime occurred before it could take someone's property. The Anti-Pogo Act dictates that the state doesn't even need to win a trial.
Again, because the crime is different.
Upon a mere finding of probable cause, the state can freeze a multi-million-dollar corporate bank account or seize a commercial skyscraper. I understand the intent is to secure operational support and protect victims, but authorizing the seizure of private property without a criminal conviction represents a profound and dangerous erosion of constitutional due process.
I understand why the phrase civil forfeiture raises alarms regarding due process, but we have to ground this in the reality of how modern money laundering works.
The reality doesn't suspend the Constitution.
If the state waits for a criminal conviction, a legal process that involves years of litigation, endless motions, appeals, delays, the assets will just vanish. Within minutes of a raid, money is transferred out through decentralized cryptocurrency exchanges. Server forms are wiped remotely, and physical equipment is moved to another jurisdiction.
But the convenience of law enforcement cannot be the enemy of constitutional rights.
It is not about the convenience of law enforcement. It's about efficacy. If you cannot secure the assets immediately, the syndicate simply uses those illicit funds to hire better lawyers, corrupt more officials, and set up a new hub under a different corporate shell.
That's a cynical view of the justice system, though.
It's realistic. The civil forfeiture mechanism upon probable cause is a globally recognized tool in combating transnational organized crime. And Section 15 explicitly notes that this will be done in accordance with rules of procedure to be formulated by the Supreme Court.
Still based on probable cause.
Yes, but this is not an arbitrary police seizure on the street. It is a judicial process overseen by the highest court in the land. When an industry generates billions in illicit funds, freezing those assets immediately is the only way to disarm the syndicate, while the slower wheels of criminal justice turn. You are applying a 20th century legal philosophy of individual analog rights to a 21st century reality of borderless digital warfare. The paradigm has shifted, and the law must shift with it.
I simply do not accept the premise that we must sacrifice foundational legal protections just because the criminal element has upgraded its technology.
Even when the old laws are useless?
Yes, the paradigm has shifted. I will readily concede that the digital, borderless nature of offshore gaming presents unique jurisdictional challenges. A law designed to catch people passing coins for juetang in a neighborhood plaza is inherently useless against a biometric server farm routing millions in crypto from overseas. I do not dispute that reality at all.
Which I think proves the absolute necessity of the severity embedded in the Anti-Pogo Act.
It proves the necessity for adaptation. It does not excuse absolute severity. My concern remains that the Anti-Pogo Act is a massive overcorrection. By employing blanket bans in Section 4 that sweep up legitimate IT infrastructure, by mandating retroactive cancellations of visas that risk victimizing the trafficked, and by lowering the threshold for property forfeiture to mere probable cause, the law basically abandons the careful proportionality that should define a just penal code.
But measured proportionality didn't work against pogos.
We are fighting a modern threat, but we are doing it by authorizing the state to wield administrative blunt force. And frankly, when the state gets comfortable bypassing due process in the name of security, it rarely gives that power back.
And my position remains that this blunt force is a necessary and proportionate paradigm shift. We have moved from a legal framework that tried to manage the minor moral decay of local numbers games to a framework defending the very sovereignty of the state.
The stakes are definitely higher.
Much higher. The Anti-Pogo Act recognizes a fundamental truth. An industry structurally intertwined with money laundering and human trafficking cannot be regulated, it cannot be taxed, and it cannot be tolerated.
Eradication over regulation.
Precisely. The absolute prohibitions, the involvement of organized crime task forces, the strict corporate liability, and the aggressive asset forfeiture, these are the only proportionate responses to an existential threat. The legal framework has finally caught up to the reality of the digital syndicate.
Well, we certainly agree that the landscape of the threat has fundamentally changed. The evolution from policing local public morals to deploying organized crime task forces against digital syndicates, it charts a fascinating, if deeply alarming, trajectory of how crime operates in the modern era.
It absolutely does. It highlights the profound tension between the state's paramount duty to adapt to modern, highly organized threats and its enduring obligation to maintain measured, proportional justice.
Right. It is a tension that defies easy resolution. It basically forces us to continuously evaluate exactly what foundational rights we are willing to concede when the state claims it is acting in the name of national security.
I completely agree. So I highly encourage our listeners to dive into the historical timeline of these penal statutes. Look closely at how the definition of public welfare has evolved from an analog concern in the 1970s to a digital battleground today. Understanding the mechanics of how the law adapts will fundamentally change how you view the statutes governing our society.
Seeing the physical laws adapt to digital crimes really puts the current legislation into a much sharper context, for sure.
Definitely. So when we analyze the legal framework evolving to face modern transnational threats, we have to ask ourselves, when the infection goes systemic, are we brave enough to put away the whack-a-mole mallet? And are we prepared for the sheer disruptive force of cutting the power entirely?